In the quiet hours before dawn, when the streets of Ouagadougou are usually lit only by the soft glow of cooking fires and the distant hum of early morning markets, something unusual broke the stillness. Trucks moved along the old military road with a heavy echo that startled families awake. A blacksmith named Daouda, who had lived his entire life in the capital, said he watched the convoy pass and felt a chill he could not explain. He told neighbors that he had never seen equipment like that in Burkina Faso before. It carried markings he did not recognize, and soldiers he had never seen. At that same moment, analysts thousands of miles away were reviewing a confidential brief warning that Russia had begun a new phase of its strategy in West Africa. It was a strategy shaped quietly, built through relationships in the Sahel, and now unfolding with a speed that caught many off guard. OECD experts described it as a shift that could reshape the balance of power in the region, but no one publicly admitted how deeply concerned they were. For many Americans watching from afar, especially those who have lived through decades of global tensions, this moment feels painfully familiar. A powerful nation makes a bold move, and suddenly the world must reconsider what peace, stability, and influence really mean. If hearing these early signs makes you pause and think about how fragile global stability can be, stay with this story. Sometimes understanding the truth behind events far from home helps us better understand our own world as well. People across Burkina Faso are wondering what this new chapter means for their future, their families, and their dreams of a more secure life. If Russia truly has a new plan for West Africa, the question is simple but unsettling. What triggered this countermove, and why is OECD suddenly worried? The answer may reveal more about the future of global power than anyone expected. In the weeks that followed, the unexpected night movements across Ouagadougou, the outlines of Russia's new plan for West Africa began to take shape. Satellite footage reviewed by independent analysts showed at least 16 heavy transport aircraft landing in Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger over a period of 45 days. These were not ordinary supply flights. Several carried components of radar arrays, mobile command centers, and armored vehicles equipped for desert terrain. Intelligence officials quietly acknowledged that 2 of the shipments included long-range surveillance technology capable of monitoring border crossings and airspace patterns across the Sahel. This was the first indication that Russia was not simply offering military assistance. It was building a network. Eyewitnesses in the border town of Dori reported seeing Russian technicians inspecting old communication towers that had been inactive for years. One shop owner named Karim said he saw teams carrying metal cases, tools, and wiring equipment as they worked late into the night with local soldiers. He told reporters that the level of organization was unlike anything he had witnessed before. Meanwhile, across Mali, local leaders reported the construction of new training facilities in rural areas far from main cities. These locations were chosen for their isolation and quick access to strategic routes that link several Sahel nations. European analysts later confirmed that the facility designs resembled those used in earlier Russian missions in Syria and the Central African Republic, suggesting that Moscow was replicating a proven model. But the movement of equipment was only the beginning. Reports soon emerged that Russian economic teams were meeting with officials in Burkina Faso to discuss alternative routes for exporting gold and manganese, bypassing traditional Western-controlled financial mechanisms. A senior mining engineer who requested anonymity said he attended a closed meeting where Russian advisors presented a digital payment framework that avoided reliance on conventional trade networks. This proposal raised immediate concern among OECD economists who feared that such a system could weaken existing financial oversight across the region. For families living near the newly active military zones, the changes stirred a mixture of hope and uncertainty. A farmer named Isa explained that he felt safer knowing that foreign militants might be deterred by the presence of stronger security infrastructure. Yet he admitted he did not fully understand why the sudden increase in activity felt so coordinated and so secretive. His elderly mother, who remembered earlier periods of foreign involvement in the region, worried that these shifts might bring unintended consequences. For viewers who believe that global stability is shaped by decisions far beyond the reach of ordinary families, this moment may feel familiar. If this story is making you reflect on how quickly alliances can change and how deeply those changes affect everyday people, feel free to share your thoughts so others can understand how moments like this echo around the world. As more evidence surfaced, it became clear that Russia's involvement extended beyond military and economic cooperation. A series of new energy agreements were quietly signed, including plans for small-scale solar installations and upgrades to older hydroelectric facilities that had been neglected for years. For many communities, these improvements offered a glimpse of hope, especially in rural areas where electricity outages were part of daily life. A school teacher in Kudugu named Awa said she was grateful when her classroom lights remained on throughout the day, for the first time in months, allowing her students to study without interruption. Yet behind the scenes, Western analysts interpreted these actions differently. They saw them as pieces of a larger strategic puzzle, one in which Russia was positioning itself as a long-term partner in West Africa, at a moment when traditional powers were losing influence. The speed of the activity, the precision of the deployments, and the scope of the agreements all pointed toward a carefully designed counter-strategy. And then came the turning point. A confidential OECD brief leaked to the media suggested that Moscow's plan was entering its second phase, one that could fundamentally alter trade routes, security cooperation, and political alliances across the region. The document warned that if the plan succeeded, the balance of global influence could shift dramatically in less than 2 years. That revelation raised a question that no one could ignore. What exactly is Russia building in West Africa? And what is the end goal of a strategy bold enough to unsettle some of the most powerful institutions in the world? The crisis reached a new peak when a confidential OECD intelligence brief surfaced, shaking governments across Europe and North America. The document, circulated privately among high-ranking officials, warned that Russia was not only expanding its military and economic footprint in West Africa, but was doing so through a coordinated strategy designed to reduce Western leverage across the entire Sahel corridor. According to sources familiar with the brief, Moscow's plan was built around 3 major pillars. The first pillar focused on hard security, centered on rapid deployment forces and integrated radar networks capable of monitoring border activity from Mauritania to Niger. The second involved a broad economic realignment that could shift the flow of gold, manganese, and uranium away from Western financial oversight. The third pillar, and the most alarming for OECD analysts, outlined a long-term energy and infrastructure framework intended to anchor West African nations into a new economic orbit. The intensity of the reaction inside OECD headquarters was immediate. Senior officials called emergency meetings as analysts debated whether Russia's growing influence could unravel decades of Western engagement in Africa. The brief described several potential scenarios in which traditional economic power could be weakened if the Sahel alliance fully embraced Russia's support. One section of the report warned that if Moscow established control over key energy projects, it would gain leverage in future negotiations involving natural resources that many Western industries depend on. The leak ignited a wave of media coverage that spread quickly across Europe and North America. Commentators on major networks compared Russia's moves to earlier Cold War strategies in regions where local alliances shifted global politics. Meanwhile, in West Africa, the reaction was far more complex. Many citizens viewed Russia's involvement as an opportunity to break free from traditional relationships that had offered little improvement to daily life. Crowds in Ouagadougou gathered near government buildings after the rumor of the OECD brief spread, holding signs calling for sovereignty and partnership built on mutual respect. Among them was a young mechanic named Farouk, who said he believed that if Russia helped strengthen local security, his family could finally live without fear of attacks from militants. But not everyone felt the same sense of optimism. A retired civil servant named Mariam expressed concern that competing powers might turn the Sahel into a new battleground for influence. She remembered earlier decades when Burkina Faso was caught between external agendas and feared that history could repeat itself. If moments like these make you reflect on how global rivalries can shape the future of ordinary families, feel free to share your thoughts so others can see why this conversation matters. Simple reflections help bring humanity to stories often buried under political headlines. Inside government offices across Burkina Faso, the leaked brief triggered intense debate. Some advisors argued that partnering with Russia offered the only realistic path toward stronger defense and economic independence. Others warned that the speed of Moscow's expansion might push Western institutions into more aggressive responses. Ibrahim Traoré held several closed-door meetings with military leaders and economic ministers to assess the potential consequences. Although no official statement was made, insiders reported that Traoré viewed the OECD leak as a sign that his government was entering a critical moment, one that required careful balance between asserting national sovereignty and preventing unnecessary escalation. The pressure intensified when new reports confirmed that Russia was preparing to roll out the second phase of its strategy. This phase involved establishing a joint resource coordination council that would oversee mineral flows across 3 Sahel countries. OECD economists feared that if this council became operational, Western oversight mechanisms would lose significant influence in the region's most valuable sectors. Across the Atlantic, American analysts voiced their own concerns. They argued that allowing Russia to shape the future of West African trade networks could alter strategic supply lines that the United States had monitored for decades. Although many acknowledged that African nations had every right to choose their partners, the geopolitical implications were undeniable. As voices from every corner of the world entered the debate, one truth became clear. The Sahel was no longer simply a region seeking stability. It had become the center of a global contest for influence. And the question that echoed through policy circles in Washington, Paris, and Brussels carried a weight that could not be ignored. If this is only the beginning of Russia's counter-strategy, what will the next phase bring? And how far is Moscow willing to go to shift the balance of power in West Africa? As Russia's activities grew more visible across West Africa, the impact on daily life became impossible to ignore. In towns stretching from Ouagadougou to Gao, families began noticing subtle but meaningful shifts. Markets that once closed early due to insecurity now stayed open longer because patrols near major roads had increased. Villagers who lived near the northern borders said they felt safer traveling to nearby farms because they saw new security posts that had been abandoned for years. Yet these moments of relief were mixed with uncertainty. Some families wondered whether the growing presence of foreign soldiers and advisors meant that larger geopolitical tensions were inching closer to their homes. Local aid groups reported that attendance in rural schools briefly increased after new electricity installations stabilized the power supply in several districts. Children who had spent many evenings studying by candlelight could now read under stable light for the first time in months. A teacher named Mariam said she watched her students' faces brighten when the fans in her classroom finally worked again during the hottest afternoon hours. She admitted she was grateful for the sudden improvements, but remained cautious, telling reporters that nothing in the Sahel ever changes without consequences. Political leaders across the region were also forced to reconsider their strategies. Inside Burkina Faso, some ministers viewed Russia's involvement as an opportunity to build a long-desired model of economic sovereignty. They argued that Western institutions had controlled the region's financial pathways for decades, and that a new partnership might break that pattern. Others feared that the rapid shift toward Moscow could provoke retaliation from OECD countries that relied on West African minerals and trade routes. Senior advisors warned Ibrahim Traoré that the next 6 months could determine whether the country strengthened its independence or faced diplomatic pressure from all sides. In Mali, political analysts noted that the public's reaction to Russia's expanding presence was shaped by years of distrust toward former partners. Many residents saw Moscow as a counterbalance to traditional powers that had failed to stabilize the region. Crowds gathered in Bamako to express support for deeper cooperation, believing it might bring long-awaited reforms to security and infrastructure. But behind the scenes, opposition figures quietly voiced concerns that relying heavily on one major power could create future dependencies that would be difficult to break. Their worry grew louder when rumors spread that Russia intended to establish long-term oversight roles in resource management councils across the Sahel. This rumor gained traction after 2 regional governors reported receiving unofficial communication encouraging them to review their ties with Western institutions. The messages did not identify their source, but analysts believed they were part of a broader effort to shift political allegiances. If hearing these stories makes you reflect on how ordinary families are often caught in the middle of global competition, feel free to share a thought so others can understand the human cost behind these decisions. Conversations like these help bring compassion back into geopolitics. As political tension rose, international development programs began facing new challenges. Several Western-funded initiatives reported delays or withdrawals due to unclear security arrangements and shifting diplomatic alignments. This left gaps in healthcare, water distribution, and agricultural support, affecting thousands of families. A nurse in Kaya said her clinic ran out of essential supplies after a shipment was postponed indefinitely. She worried that the geopolitical struggle was beginning to affect the most vulnerable people, the ones who had the least influence over political decisions. Yet not all the consequences were negative. Some villages reported that new Russian-backed infrastructure projects improved access to clean water through repaired boreholes and restored pumping systems. A farmer named Adu explained that after years of broken equipment, his community finally had enough water to irrigate small fields during the dry season. He said he did not care who fixed the machinery as long as his children could drink clean water and his cattle could survive. Still, even with these improvements, a deeper question lingered over the Sahel. The region was changing rapidly, too rapidly for many people to fully understand. The involvement of a major global power had begun reshaping political identities, economic strategies, and the daily rhythms of ordinary life. But at the same time, the shift created new vulnerabilities that could pull the region into a larger geopolitical contest. As families continued their routines, as leaders debated their alliances, and as global institutions examined their next moves, the situation grew increasingly fragile. The next chapter depended on decisions that could tip the balance toward stability or ignite a dangerous backlash, and the world was left to wonder. If Russia's growing influence has already caused this level of change, what will happen when the third phase of its strategy finally unfolds? Across Washington, the revelations about Russia's expanding structure in West Africa triggered a wave of closed-door discussions. Senior analysts at the Pentagon argued that the Sahel was becoming a strategic flashpoint that could influence global security far beyond Africa's borders. They warned that the new radar networks and training sites, built with Russian assistance, might give Moscow indirect control over key air corridors and trade routes that the United States had monitored for decades. Economic advisors added that if Russia gained leverage over gold and uranium flows, it could alter international markets and weaken oversight mechanisms that OECD members depend on. Policymakers in Europe were equally unsettled. Diplomats in Paris described the rapid shift as a historic loss of influence and privately acknowledged that traditional European strategies in the region were failing. German analysts raised concerns that instability in West Africa could accelerate migration pressures toward Europe, especially if development programs tied to Western funding continued to be disrupted. Meanwhile, in Moscow, officials framed their actions as a response to years of Western sanctions and geopolitical isolation. They portrayed their partnerships with the Sahel Alliance as mutually beneficial relationships built on respect rather than coercion. In Beijing, Chinese commentators examined the situation through an economic lens. noting that a Russian foothold in West Africa could reshape competition for infrastructure, mining, and energy contracts. Some Chinese strategists predicted that the region could become a key arena where Moscow and Beijing tested new forms of cooperation. For Americans watching from home, especially those who lived through the Cold War, the pattern felt strikingly familiar. A distant region suddenly becomes the center of a global contest. Major powers adjust their strategies, and ordinary families watch their world shift without warning. If hearing these developments makes you reflect on how quickly global balance can change, you can share a thought so others can see why moments like this deserve attention. Understanding these shifts helps keep conversations grounded in both reality and compassion. As debates continued across global institutions, one question rose above every other. If Russia is already altering political and economic structures across West Africa, what impact will the final phase of its plan have on the world? And is the international community prepared for the consequences that may follow? As the story of Russia's expanding presence in West Africa enters its next chapter, one truth has become clear. The Sahel is no longer a distant frontier overshadowed by endless hardship. It has become a crossroads where global power, local sovereignty, and the hopes of ordinary families collide in ways the world can no longer ignore. The actions unfolding across Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger reveal a region striving to break free from old patterns, while powerful nations move carefully to protect their interests. Many experts believe the months ahead will determine whether this transformation leads to renewed stability, or whether it ignites a new era of geopolitical tension that stretches far beyond Africa. Analysts warn that if Russia proceeds with the third phase of its plan, the one quietly described in classified documents as a complete realignment of mineral and energy corridors, the consequences could reshape international markets and redirect political alliances for years to come. For families in the Sahel, this is not just a matter of strategy. It is about whether their children will grow up in communities defined by opportunity or overshadowed by conflict. A grandmother in Niamey said she prays each night that the powerful nations watching her region will choose wisdom over ambition and understanding over dominance. Her words carry a quiet truth that crosses every border. If this story makes you pause and reflect on the fragile balance that holds our world together, feel free to share a thought so others can understand why moments like this matter. Honest conversations remind us that beneath every headline are human lives shaped by decisions they do not control. As the world watches closely, one question rises above the noise of competing narratives. Is Russia building a path toward a new partnership in West Africa, or preparing the ground for a long contest that could challenge some of the most influential institutions on Earth? The answer remains uncertain, but one hope endures: that leaders will choose a future grounded in fairness and responsibility, and that families across the Sahel will one day sleep without fear of sudden change. May God watch over every child, every parent, and every village looking for peace as this story continues to unfold.